My name is Dolores Ferreira, and for 11 years, I kept another family's secrets clean. Not the kind of secrets you whisper, the kind you dust around, the kind you learn to walk past without looking at too long. Because in a house like the Vance mansion, curiosity wasn't just discouraged, it was dangerous. There was one door in that house I was never allowed to open. Not, please don't. Not, we'd prefer you didn't. I was told, on my very first day, by a woman with a smile like a closed fist. You will never open that door. Not to clean it, not to look inside it, not if the house is on fire. Do you understand me? I nodded. I needed the job too badly to ask why. For 11 years, I vacuumed around that door. I polished the brass handle without ever turning it. I lied to my own daughter when she asked what was behind it, because I genuinely didn't know. And then, on the last day I ever set foot in that house, the day they finally threw me away like a used rag, I opened it anyway. What I found inside didn't just change my life. It exposed exactly what kind of people the Vance family really were. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to want to know what happened to Bradford and Celeste Vance. And trust me, it's satisfying. 11 years ago, I was 34 years old, recently divorced, with a 6-year-old daughter named Marisol, and $340 in a checking account that was already spoken for. I'd cleaned houses before, small ones, modest ones, the kind where the owners handed you a check and a glass of water and told you to take your time. Nothing prepared me for the address my cleaning agency sent me to that October morning. 14 Blackthorn Hill Road, Greenwich, Connecticut. The gate alone was taller than my apartment building. The Vance estate wasn't a house, it was a statement. 11 bedrooms, a library with a rolling ladder, an indoor pool with a mosaic tile floor imported from Portugal, and a staff of exactly one full-time housekeeper, because Mrs. Celeste Vance did not like strangers cycling through her home. I would learn later that this wasn't about privacy, it was about control. I met Celeste Vance first, early 50s, blonde, dressed like she was perpetually about to be photographed. Her husband, Bradford Vance, ran a private equity firm in Manhattan and was rarely home before 9 at night. Their 2 adult children were long gone, one in California, one estranged entirely, though nobody would tell me why. And then there was Bradford's father, Ellis Vance, 81 years old, founder of the family's original business, a modest furniture manufacturing company he'd built with his own hands in the 1960s, before it grew into something enormous. He lived in the east wing of the house, mostly alone, mostly forgotten by his son and daughter-in-law, except when they needed him to sign something. Ellis was the only person in that house who ever looked me in the eye. On my first day, Celeste walked me through the property like a drill sergeant. Kitchen, formal dining, never touch the china without gloves, the West Wing guest suites, the home theatre, and then, at the end of the second-floor east hallway, a heavy oak door with a brass plaque that simply read, Private. This door, Celeste said, and her voice changed, flattened. You will never open it. Not to clean it, not to look inside it, not if the house is on fire. Do you understand me? I said yes. I didn't ask why. You learn quickly, in that line of work, that why is a question reserved for people who can afford to ask it. I told myself it was probably nothing dramatic. A panic room, maybe. A wine cellar. Rich people loved having rooms with names ordinary people didn't need. But over the weeks that followed, the house developed a rhythm, and that door never seemed to belong to it. Every room in the mansion breathed. The kitchen woke before sunrise. The laundry room hummed all afternoon. Guests drifted through the dining room. Contractors came and went. Deliveries arrived. Somewhere in the house there was always movement. Except that hallway. The closer you got to the oak door, the quieter everything felt, as though the house itself lowered its voice out of respect. Or fear. I can't explain it any better than that. Sometimes I'd finish polishing the brass handle and realize I'd been holding my breath without meaning to. After a few months, I stopped asking myself what was behind it, not because I'd stopped wondering, because wondering had started to make me uncomfortable. For the first few years, my job was simple, exhausting, and lonely. I cleaned 6 days a week, 8 hours a day, for $14 an hour, well below market rate. But I told myself the steady hours mattered more than the number. Celeste treated me the way some people treat furniture. She'd walk past me mid-sentence like I wasn't there. She corrected the way I folded towels in front of dinner guests, loud enough for the whole room to hear. Once, she accused me of stealing a pair of earrings she'd simply misplaced in her own gym bag, and never apologized when they turned up 3 days later. Bradford was worse in a quieter way. He never yelled. He just erased you. If I greeted him in the hallway, he'd look through me like I was a draft coming from an open window. But Ellis was different. Ellis Vance would sit in his reading chair by the east wing window every morning with a cup of black coffee, and when I came in to dust his shelves, he'd ask me real questions. How was Marisol doing in school? Did I need him to write a letter of recommendation when she applied to college one day? He remembered her name. He remembered mine. You know, he told me once, maybe 4 years in, I built this whole company out of a garage in Bridgeport, 60-hour weeks. My hands used to bleed from the machinery. He looked at his own hands, spotted with age. My son thinks money is something you're born into. I know better. I know what it costs the people who actually build things. I didn't understand, at the time, how much that sentence mattered. One rainy afternoon, the power flickered, and the house fell strangely quiet. Ellis closed the book he was reading and watched the rain collect against the window for a long moment. You know what the hardest part of getting old is, Dolores? I looked up from the shelf I was dusting. People stop listening. He smiled softly. No. He folded his hands together. It's finally having enough time to admit all the things you spent your younger years refusing to see. I wasn't sure what to say. He continued anyway. Everyone thinks money changes people. His eyes stayed on the rain. Sometimes it doesn't. There was a long pause. Sometimes it simply gives them permission to become more of who they already were. He sighed. Bradford wasn't born believing people were disposable. That caught my attention. He learned some of it from me. I frowned. I taught him to chase growth. Bigger contracts. Bigger factories. Bigger numbers. I kept telling myself I was building something for my family. He gave a quiet, almost embarrassed laugh. Turns out I was teaching my son that success is measured by what you own instead of who you become. His voice dropped. By the time I realized the difference, he'd already become better at business than I ever was. Another silence settled between us. Then he looked at me and smiled again. Life has an odd way of giving old men one last chance to correct their mistakes. At the time, I thought he was talking about making peace with Bradford. Years later, I realized he wasn't. He'd occasionally glance down the hall toward that oak door with the brass plaque, and something would cross his face. Not quite sadness, not quite guilt. Once he caught me looking at it while I dusted the hallway table. It wasn't the first time I'd been caught staring. A few months earlier, I'd been polishing the hallway mirror when I glanced toward the door a second too long. I didn't hear Bradford approach. Interesting room, isn't it? His voice came from directly behind me. I nearly dropped the polish bottle. I'm sorry, Mr. Vance. I was just looking. He smiled. Not warmly. The kind of smile that never reached a person's eyes. He walked past me without another word, stopped in front of the oak door, and rested one hand on the brass handle. For a moment, I thought he was going to open it. Instead, he looked back at me. Some doors stay closed because the people behind them deserve privacy. A pause. Others stay closed because the people outside them don't need the burden of what's inside. Then he let go of the handle and walked away. I stood there long after he'd disappeared down the stairs. It wasn't what he'd said that unsettled me. It was the feeling that he'd been watching me long before I'd noticed him. Curious about that one, he asked, almost amused. I was told never to ask, I said carefully. He nodded slowly. Good. Not yet. He said it with the certainty of someone who already knew how the story ended. I wouldn't understand why until years later. Then quieter, almost to himself. But someday, Dolores, Someday that door is going to matter more than any of them think. I told myself it was just an old man's riddle. I had bills to pay and a daughter to raise. I didn't have room in my life for mysteries. Let me be honest with you about what 11 years in that house actually cost me. It cost me my back. 2 herniated discs from years of scrubbing floors on my knees because Celeste didn't believe in unsightly cleaning equipment being visible when guests were expected. It cost me holidays with Marisol because the Vances hosted Thanksgiving and Christmas every single year and expected me on call for the entire week, unpaid overtime included, because I was salaried for convenience, a fact I only understood the legal implications of years later. It cost me my pride more times than I can count. There was the Christmas party, my 7th year there, when Celeste introduced me to her guests as the help, while I was standing directly in front of her, holding a tray of hors d'oeuvres. A few guests laughed. One woman, to her credit, looked mortified and mouthed, "Sorry," at me from across the room. I smiled and kept serving, because smiling and serving was the job. There was the time I slipped on a wet staircase carrying laundry and fractured my wrist. Celeste's first words weren't, "Are you okay?" They were, "Please tell me you didn't drop anything." I paid for the emergency room out of pocket. I came back to work 4 days later because I couldn't afford not to, and there was Bradford, who I watched, over 11 years, slowly and deliberately push his own father toward isolation. Fewer visits from Ellis's old business partners, fewer calls returned. A caregiver recommended by Bradford, who I later learned was reporting Ellis's private conversations back to him. I watched a son quietly dismantle his father's independence, one small decision at a time, always with a smile, always framed as what's best for Dad. Ellis noticed. He wasn't a fool. But he was 80-something, and increasingly frail, and there's only so much a man can do against his own blood, when the house, the money, and eventually the paperwork all belong to someone else. In my 10th year, Ellis's health began to decline seriously. Fewer mornings by the window, more days in bed. I was the one who brought him his meals when the recommended caregiver conveniently had the day off. I was the one who sat with him during a bad flu that turned into pneumonia, holding his hand while Bradford was in a board meeting, and Celeste was at the spa, but sending her love. One evening, near the end, Ellis gripped my hand tighter than I expected for a man that frail. "Dolores, listen to me." His voice was thin but urgent. "When I'm gone, they will try to erase everything that isn't convenient for them. Everything. You understand? Mr. Vance, don't talk like that. The door," he said. "The East Wing door. When the time comes, and you'll know when, you open it, no matter what anyone tells you. Promise me." I promised him, mostly to comfort a dying man. I didn't understand what he meant. I still don't think I fully believed it was real. Ellis Vance passed away 11 days later, in his sleep, in the room down the hall from that locked door. I cried at his funeral in the back row, behind caterers who'd been hired for the reception. Nobody from the family sat with me. Nobody acknowledged the 11 years I'd spent in that house. 6 of them, tending to a man his own family had quietly abandoned. 6 weeks after the funeral, everything changed, and not in the way I expected. Bradford and Celeste came back from a 2-week trip to Aspen to grieve privately, tanned, and relaxed in a way that struck me as obscene. Within days, contractors were walking through the house, not for repairs, for an appraisal. They were selling, not the whole estate, just gutting the East Wing. Ellis's private study, his reading chair by the window, his old business archives, all of it slated for demolition to build what Celeste described to a designer as a proper home gym and screening room, finally, now that we don't need to accommodate anyone. Accommodate anyone. That was her father-in-law, dead 6 weeks, and already a scheduling inconvenience she was relieved to be rid of. I overheard this conversation while vacuuming the hallway outside the study, the same hallway with the oak door. Then, 3 days later, Celeste called me into the kitchen. She didn't offer me a seat. "Dolores, we've decided to bring in a full-service cleaning company. Weekly, not daily. It's more efficient for a house this size going forward. A pause. We'll pay out this month, but Friday will be your last day. 11 years, summarized in 4 sentences and delivered without a flicker of discomfort on her face. After 11 years, I said quietly, is there severance? Anything? Bradford, who I hadn't even realized was standing in the doorway, answered for her. Dolores, you were paid weekly. There's no contract implying ongoing obligation. He said it the way you'd explain a parking ticket. Clean, legal, cold. I want you to notice something here, because it matters. I had given that family 11 years of my one and only life. I had nursed their dying father when they couldn't be bothered, and the reward for that loyalty was a 4-sentence dismissal and a reminder that, legally, they owed me nothing. I went home that night and cried in my car in the parking lot, so Marisol, now 17, wouldn't see me fall apart. Then I did what I always did. I went back Friday for my last shift, because that's what you do when you need the final paycheck more than you need your dignity. But something in me had shifted. Ellis's words kept circling back. You'll know when. Promise me. I think, somewhere in the last 11 years, without meaning to, I had started to believe him. Friday came. My final day at 14 Blackthorn Hill Road. Celeste had left a checklist on the counter. No goodbye, no thank you, just tasks. Bradford was at the office. The house was, for the first time in 11 years, entirely empty except for me. I finished the checklist by 2 in the afternoon. I packed my small bag of personal cleaning supplies, the ones I'd bought myself over the years, because the Vances never restocked anything I actually asked for. I stood in the front hallway, ready to walk out the same door I'd walked in through 11 years earlier. And then I looked down the east hallway, the oak door, the brass plaque, private. I stood there for a long time, longer than I want to admit. Every warning Celeste had ever given me played on a loop. You will never open that door, not if the house is on fire. But so did Ellis's voice, thin, urgent, from a hospital bed of sorts in his own home. You'll know when. Promise me. They were tearing this wing down in 2 weeks. Whatever was behind that door, whatever Ellis had wanted me to see, would be gone forever, crushed under a contractor's dumpster, along with 60 years of a man's actual life's work, discarded by a son who'd already decided his father was an inconvenience even before he was in the ground. I walked down that hallway. My hands were shaking. I told myself I could still turn around. Halfway down the hallway, I stopped. For the first time in 11 years, I listened instead of walked. The mansion had never felt so empty. No television humming in the family room. No footsteps from upstairs. No vacuum competing with distant conversations. Just silence. I reached into my apron pocket and realized I was still carrying the master keyring I'd used every day for more than a decade. My fingers instinctively searched for a key that didn't exist. Then I laughed under my breath. All those years, I'd convinced myself the room must require some special key. It had never occurred to me that the only thing keeping me out was permission. I slipped the keyring back into my pocket. Suddenly, a car door slammed outside. My heart nearly stopped. I looked toward the front windows. Someone had pulled into the driveway. Please don't be Bradford. I whispered it without realizing. I stood frozen for what felt like forever. Then I heard a man's voice outside, followed by another. Contractors, measuring tape, laughter. They hadn't come into the house. Not yet. If Ellis had left me something, I suddenly understood I might have only minutes before someone walked through that front door. That was the moment fear finally lost the argument. I reached for the brass handle. It wasn't locked. 11 years, and it had never once been locked. I stood there, staring at the latch, almost angry with myself. For more than a decade, I'd imagined hidden keys, secret locks, alarms, something. There had been none. The strongest lock in that house had never been made of steel. They'd controlled me with a sentence, not a deadbolt. Okay, before we go any further, I need you to comment right now what you think is behind that door. Money? A body? A secret family? Drop your guess below, because in about 2 minutes, you're going to find out if you were right. The room wasn't what I expected at all. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. It wasn't dusty. That surprised me first. Nothing in the room looked abandoned same. It looked protected, as though time itself had been instructed to leave it alone. No horror, no hidden crime scene, despite what 11 years of ominous warnings had built up in my imagination. It was a study, modest, compared to the rest of the mansion, almost humble, wood-paneled walls, a single window overlooking the garden, a desk that looked handmade, actual tool marks visible along the edges. This was the original office. From the garage-turned company Ellis had built in 1962, moved piece by piece into this house decades later, and preserved exactly as it once was. Old blueprints of furniture designs pinned to a corkboard, a black and white photo of a much younger Ellis standing in front of his very first workshop, arm around a woman I assumed was his late wife. And on the desk, centered, like it had been placed there, deliberately and recently, a sealed envelope with my name on it. Dolores. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I opened it. Inside was a letter, dated just 3 months before Ellis passed, and a second, thicker envelope beneath it. Legal documents, with a law firm's letterhead I didn't recognize. The letter read, in Ellis's careful, old-fashioned handwriting, Dolores, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you kept your promise. Thank you. I built everything I have with my own 2 hands, and in 60 years, you are one of only a handful of people who ever treated me like I still had hands worth respecting, not a signature on a checkbook. My son and his wife believe money is something you inherit. I know it's something you earn, and something you give to people who've earned it back. 11 years ago, I watched you work yourself to exhaustion for people who never once said thank you. I watched you hold my hand when my own son couldn't find 20 minutes. I amended my will privately, through my own attorney, 6 months before I died, separate from the family trust Bradford manages. I set aside the original company archive, this study, and a trust fund equal to 11 years of fair market wages, benefits, and interest. The wages you should have earned all along, not the ones you were given. Bradford does not know this exists. Celeste does not know this exists. Call the number below, ask for Mr. Alvarez. He has been holding this for you since the day I signed it. You were never the help, Dolores. You were the only person who ever actually saw me. I sat down on the floor of that study and cried harder than I had at his funeral. I called Mr. Alvarez that same afternoon, sitting in my car outside the gates of Blackthorn Hill Road for the last time. He confirmed everything. Ellis Vance had executed a separate, legally binding trust 18 months before his death, fully independent of the family estate Bradford controlled, naming me as sole beneficiary of a fund specifically calculated to correct 11 years of what the document literally termed undercompensated labor and demonstrated personal loyalty exceeding contractual obligation. The number was substantial, life-changing, for a single mother who'd been counting quarters for gas money 6 weeks earlier. But here's the part that made this story worth telling. Bradford Vance found out about the trust 2 weeks later, because Connecticut probate filings are a matter of public record, and his own attorney flagged it during the estate settlement process. He was furious. He tried to contest it, claiming his father lacked testamentary capacity at the time of signing, hiring an entirely separate legal team to challenge a dying man's final wish to treat someone with basic human decency. So, the case did not go well for him. Mr. Alvarez had insisted on video documenting Ellis's signing appointment, specifically because he anticipated exactly this kind of challenge. Ellis, sharp as ever on camera, explaining precisely why he was doing this, and precisely what he thought of his son's treatment of the only person in this house who never once needed reminding I was still a human being. Bradford's contest was dismissed within 4 months. The judge's written opinion noted, and I'm paraphrasing rather than quoting directly, that the video evidence showed a testator of clear mind, sound judgment, and specific, well-reasoned intent, and that the family's own conduct toward the housekeeper, as described in the documentation, undermined rather than supported their claims. It became a minor local news story, a wealthy Greenwich family publicly humiliated in probate court, contesting a modest trust left to their longtime housekeeper, only to lose and pay their own legal fees plus the housekeeper's, as ordered by the court for a filing found to be made in bad faith. Celeste Vance, I later heard through mutual contacts, stopped attending her country club events for the better part of a year. I did not gloat. I didn't need to. The truth did the work for me. I didn't buy a mansion. I didn't quit working entirely. That's not who I am, and honestly, it's not who Ellis was either. I paid off my remaining debts. I bought Marisol's college education outright. No loans, something I'd cried about not being able to afford just 8 months earlier. I put a down payment on a small house, modest, 3 bedrooms, a real yard, the first home I ever owned outright in my name, and I started my own small cleaning company. Not because I needed the money anymore, but because I remembered what it felt like to be underpaid, overworked, and treated like furniture, and I wanted to build something where the women who worked for me would never feel that way. Fair wages, real benefits, actual thank yous. I named it after him, Vance and Ferreira Home Services. Not because I needed his name for credibility, I genuinely didn't need his money to survive anymore, but because for 11 years, an old man in a chair by a window was the only person in that entire mansion who ever looked at me like I mattered. He kept his promise to me, even after he was gone. The least I could do was keep mine. I think about that door sometimes, how for 11 years, 3 words on a brass plaque had more power over me than the truth ever did, how a family used silence and intimidation to keep me compliant, right up until the moment silence couldn't protect them anymore. I think about Bradford and Celeste too, not with hatred, not anymore, with something closer to pity. They had every material advantage a person could ask for, and they still couldn't manage basic decency toward the woman who held their dying father's hand when they couldn't be bothered. Ellis Vance built furniture with his hands and a fortune with his mind, but the thing I'll actually remember him for is smaller than both. He was the only person in that house who ever said thank you. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's this. Pay attention to the people who show up for you when nobody's watching, and be careful how you treat the people who have less power than you. You never really know which door they're going to open one day.